The Alpha King left a single silver coin to test the Tavern Maid. What she whispered rewrote his fate. The autumn wind swept through the cobblestone streets of Ashford, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and wood smoke. The town, nestled in the rolling hills of the Massachusetts colony, had grown prosperous from its position along the trade routes connecting Boston to the inland settlements. Merchants passed through daily, their wagons heavy with goods, and the local tavern, the Silver Boar, had become the heart of commerce and gossip alike. Eleanor Hartwell moved between the wooden tables with practiced efficiency, her worn apron spotted with ale stains, and her dark hair pulled back beneath a simple cap. At 23, she had spent the last 6 years working in her uncle's tavern, ever since her parents had died during a harsh winter. The work was exhausting, the patrons often crude, but it was honest labor that kept a roof over her head and food in her belly. She had learned to read the faces of travelers, the merchants who counted every copper, the soldiers who drank to forget, the farmers who sought brief respite from their labors. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales from history. The afternoon crowd had thinned when the stranger entered. Eleanor noticed him immediately, though he wore simple traveling clothes, a dark wool coat, leather boots caked with road dust, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. Something in his bearing set him apart from the usual clientele. He moved with a quiet confidence, his shoulders straight despite the weight of apparent fatigue, and when he settled into a corner table, his eyes swept the room with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "What can I bring you, sir?" Eleanor asked, approaching with her wooden serving tray tucked under one arm. The man looked up, and for a moment, Eleanor felt her breath catch. His features were sharp and weathered, his jaw covered in several days' growth of beard, but his eyes, a striking shade of gray, held an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her carefully maintained composure. "Ale, and whatever food is hot," he said, his voice low and measured. There was an accent there, something not quite local, though Eleanor couldn't place it precisely. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where her Uncle Thomas was stirring a pot of venison stew. "The man in the corner, have you seen him before?" Thomas glanced through the serving window and shook his head. "Another traveler. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Eleanor replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this particular stranger was different. She filled a tankard with ale and ladled stew into a wooden bowl, adding a thick slice of bread still warm from the morning's baking. When she returned to his table, the man was studying a worn leather journal, his fingers tracing lines of text she couldn't quite see. He looked up as she set down the food, and for the first time, she saw the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you," he said, then added, "You're the owner's daughter?" "Niece," Eleanor corrected. "My uncle owns the Silver Boar." He nodded slowly, as though filing away this information. "You work hard." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor found herself responding anyway. "Everyone works hard here, sir. It's how we survive." "Survival," he repeated. The word carrying a weight she didn't understand. "Yes, I suppose it is." Eleanor left him to his meal, attending to the other patrons, a group of local farmers arguing about the best methods for clearing new land, a traveling peddler mending his coat by the fire, 2 young militiamen drinking away their nervousness before departing for frontier duty. The stranger ate slowly, methodically, his attention divided between his food and the journal before him. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the tavern began to fill again. The working day was ending, and men sought the warmth and companionship that coin could buy. Eleanor's feet ached, and a headache throbbed behind her eyes, but she kept moving, kept smiling, kept filling tankards and clearing tables. It was nearly dark when the stranger finally rose to settle his account. He approached the bar where Thomas was counting the day's earnings, and Eleanor moved closer, curious despite herself. "What do I owe you?" the stranger asked. Thomas calculated quickly. 3 pence for the ale and stew. The man reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather purse. Eleanor watched as he counted coins onto the scarred wooden bar, but instead of 3 copper pennies, he placed a single silver coin. Even in the dim lamplight, Eleanor could see it gleaming, worth far more than the humble meal warranted. Thomas stared at the coin, then at the stranger. "Sir, this is too much. The meal was only—" "Keep it," the man interrupted. His gray eyes swept across the tavern, lingering briefly on Eleanor, before returning to Thomas. "Consider it payment for the hospitality." Before Thomas could protest further, the stranger turned and walked toward the door. Eleanor felt something stir within her. Not the calculated courtesy she showed all patrons, but a genuine impulse she didn't fully understand. She grabbed a cloth from the bar and hurried after him, catching him just as he reached the threshold. "Sir, wait," she called. He turned, one hand on the doorframe, his expression unreadable in the shadows. Eleanor held out the cloth. It was clean, white, one of the few good pieces her mother had left her. "For your journey," she said quietly. "The roads are muddy this time of year. You'll want something clean." He stared at the cloth, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper and more complicated. "You don't know me," he said. "I could be anyone." "That's true of everyone who walks through that door," Eleanor replied. "But you paid far more than you needed to. Either you're terrible with money, or you understand what that silver means to people like us. Either way, you deserve kindness in return." The stranger reached out and took the cloth, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, though whether from the touch itself or the intensity of his gaze, she couldn't say. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eleanor Hartwell." He folded the cloth carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Thank you, Eleanor Hartwell. I won't forget this." Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness, and Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching until even the sound of his footsteps had faded. When she returned inside, Thomas was still staring at the silver coin on the bar. "Who do you think he was?" her uncle asked. Eleanor shook her head, unable to explain the strange certainty that had settled in her chest. "I don't know, but I think we'll find out." The next morning dawned cold and gray, with frost coating the tavern windows and breath misting in the air. Eleanor woke before sunrise as always, to help prepare breakfast for the early travelers. Her small room above the tavern was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chest for her few belongings, but it was hers, and she had made it as comfortable as her circumstances allowed. A single candle provided light as she dressed in her usual work clothes, a simple gray dress, worn but clean, and the apron she'd scrubbed the night before. Downstairs, Thomas was already stoking the fire in the main room's large hearth. The tavern felt different in these quiet hours before the rush of the day, almost peaceful. Eleanor set about her morning tasks, sweeping the floor, wiping down tables, preparing the ingredients for the day's meals. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of long practice, but her mind kept returning to the stranger from the previous evening. There had been something in his eyes when she'd given him the cloth, a flicker of emotion she couldn't name, but recognized nonetheless. It was the look of someone who had forgotten that kindness existed, or perhaps who had stopped expecting it. Eleanor knew that look because she'd seen it in her own reflection during the hardest months after her parents' death, when the world had seemed cold and unforgiving. "You're quiet this morning," Thomas observed, breaking her reverie. Her uncle was a broad man with gentle eyes and hands scarred from years of labor. He'd taken her in without hesitation when she'd had nowhere else to go, asking nothing in return but honest work. She loved him for that, even if she sometimes chafed at the limitations of her life. "Just thinking," Eleanor replied, setting out pewter plates for the breakfast service. "About our generous stranger?" She felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was wondering who he might be. That's all. Thomas chuckled. Probably just a merchant with more money than sense. Though I'll admit, there was something unusual about him. The way he watched everything, like a hawk circling prey. Before Eleanor could respond, the tavern door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 militiamen she recognized from the local garrison. They stomped their boots to dislodge the frost and made straight for the fire, calling for hot porridge and ale to warm their bones. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of service and conversation. Eleanor learned that tensions were rising again with the French to the north, that the governor had called for more volunteers to reinforce the frontier settlements, that a traveling preacher was expected in town by week's end to deliver sermons about salvation and damnation. She listened to it all, filing away information as she always did, understanding that knowledge was a form of currency in its own right. It was mid-morning when a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the frost-clouded windows, Eleanor could see a group of horsemen riding down the main street. Not the usual travelers or local militia, but something else entirely. Their horses were magnificent beasts, well-bred and well-fed, and the riders wore clothing that spoke of wealth and authority. The lead rider carried a banner she didn't recognize, though the colors, deep blue and silver, seemed vaguely familiar. The tavern's patrons crowded toward the windows, murmuring speculation. Eleanor stayed at the bar, suddenly uneasy. Something about the procession felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. The horseman stopped directly in front of the silver boar. Thomas moved toward the door, smoothing his apron nervously. "Stay back, Eleanor. Let me see what they want." But before her uncle could reach the threshold, the door swung open and 2 of the riders entered, both armed, both carrying themselves with the rigid discipline of trained soldiers. They surveyed the room with cold efficiency, then one of them spoke in a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "Is this the establishment known as the Silver Boar?" "It is," Thomas confirmed, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I'm Thomas Hartwell, the proprietor. How can I help you, gentlemen?" The soldier ignored the question and instead pulled a small object from his belt pouch, a piece of white cloth. Eleanor's breath stopped. Even from across the room, she recognized it as the cloth she'd given the stranger the night before. "We're looking for the person who gave this to our lord," the soldier said. "He wishes to speak with them." The tavern had gone completely silent. Every eye turned toward Eleanor, who stood frozen behind the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas looked at her, confusion and concern warring on his face. "Eleanor?" he said quietly. "What is this about?" She swallowed hard and stepped forward, her legs unsteady. "I gave him that cloth, last night. He was a traveler who paid for his meal, and I just wanted to offer him something for his journey." The soldier's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps approval, perhaps simply acknowledgement. "Then you are Eleanor Hartwell?" "I am. Our Lord requests your presence, immediately." Thomas moved to stand between Eleanor and the soldiers. "Now wait just a minute. You can't simply demand that my niece go with you. Who is this lord you speak of? What authority do you have?" The second soldier stepped forward, and this time his hand rested deliberately on the pommel of his sword. "The authority of William Blackwood, appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by His Majesty King George, and he is not a man accustomed to being kept waiting." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Governor Blackwood. The stranger who had sat in her tavern, eating stew from a wooden bowl and writing in a worn journal, was the most powerful man in the colony. Stories about him were legendary. A military commander who had distinguished himself in campaigns against the French and their native allies. A stern administrator who had brought order to the chaotic frontier settlements. A man rumored to be as ruthless as he was effective. And she had given him a cloth like he was any common traveler. "I'll come," Eleanor heard herself say, though the words seemed to come from far away. "Just Just give me a moment to get my cloak. Thomas gripped her arm. Eleanor, you don't have to do this. We don't know what he wants. But Eleanor knew, with the strange certainty that had been growing in her chest since the moment she'd pressed that cloth into the stranger's hand, that this was a turning point. Whatever happened next would change everything. I have to, Uncle Thomas, she said gently. It'll be all right. She retrieved her cloak, threadbare and patched, but the warmest garment she owned, and followed the soldiers outside. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, and she pulled the cloak tighter as she approached the waiting horses. The lead rider, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, studied her with obvious skepticism. You're the Tavern Maid? I am. He shook his head slightly as though unable to reconcile something in his mind, then gestured to one of the other soldiers. Help her mount. We ride immediately. Eleanor had ridden horses before, though never anything as fine as these animals. The soldier who assisted her was surprisingly gentle, ensuring she was secure in the saddle before mounting his own horse. Then they were moving, the group turning as one and cantering down the street toward the edge of town, leaving behind a crowd of stunned onlookers and one very worried uncle. They rode for perhaps 20 minutes, following the main road until they reached a large estate that Eleanor had seen from a distance but never visited. The house itself was impressive. 3 stories of gray stone with tall windows and a slate roof, surrounded by well-maintained grounds, now brown with autumn's death. Soldiers stood guard at the gates and patrolled the perimeter, and Eleanor realized this must be the governor's official residence. She was led inside through a side entrance, past servants who stared with open curiosity, and up a broad staircase to the second floor. The house was warm, heated by multiple fireplaces, and Eleanor caught glimpses of fine furniture, oil paintings, and carpets that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. The contrast with her own sparse existence was almost painful. Finally, they stopped before a heavy wooden door. The lead soldier knocked once, waited for a response, then pushed it open and gestured for Eleanor to enter. The room beyond was clearly a study, shelves lined with books, a large desk covered with papers and maps, and windows that overlooked the estate's grounds. And standing by those windows, hands clasped behind his back, was the stranger from the tavern, Governor Blackwood. He had cleaned up since the previous evening, his beard trimmed, his clothing now befitting his station. A fine coat of dark blue wool, polished boots, and a white shirt with careful stitching. But his eyes were the same, still that intense gray that seemed to see too much. The door closed behind Eleanor, leaving them alone. For a long moment, neither spoke. Eleanor felt the weight of the silence, the absurdity of her presence in this place, the vast gulf between their respective positions in the world's hierarchy. She was a tavern maid with calloused hands and worn shoes. He was the king's appointed representative, a man who commanded armies and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Do you know who I am?" he finally asked, turning to face her fully. "Yes, sir, Governor Blackwood. And yet yesterday, when I sat in your uncle's tavern, you treated me no differently than any other traveler." Eleanor wasn't sure if this was an accusation or an observation. "I didn't know who you were, sir." "No," he agreed, moving to sit behind his desk. "You didn't. And that, Miss Hartwell, is precisely why I wanted to speak with you." He gestured to a chair across from the desk, and Eleanor sat carefully, conscious of how out of place she must look in this refined setting. Governor Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same intense focus. "I left that silver coin as a test," he said bluntly. "I've been conducting these tests throughout the colony for the past several weeks, visiting various establishments incognito to observe how people behave when they believe themselves unobserved by authority. Most innkeepers and tavern owners pocket the excess payment without comment. Some become suspicious and refuse it. But you..." He paused. a slight smile touching his lips. You gave me something of your own in return. Why? Eleanor chose her words carefully. The amount you paid showed either ignorance or generosity. I preferred to assume generosity. And if someone is generous to us, it seems right to be generous in return, even in a small way. A cloth, he said, pulling the item in question from a drawer in his desk. White, well-maintained, of reasonable quality. Your mother's? She felt a pang at the mention of her mother, but kept her voice steady. Yes, sir. And you gave it to a stranger. Someone who might have been a thief, a scoundrel, or worse. Or someone who might have needed kindness, Eleanor countered, then immediately regretted the boldness of her words. But Governor Blackwood didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression serious. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to be frank with you. This colony is facing difficult times. The French are pushing south from Canada. The native tribes are increasingly hostile, and the settlers are spread thin across territory we can barely defend. I need people around me who can be trusted, not because they fear punishment, but because they possess genuine integrity. Your action yesterday, small as it was, demonstrated something I rarely see: the instinct to treat others with dignity regardless of who they might be. Eleanor's heart was pounding. I'm not sure I understand, sir. I'm offering you a position, he said simply. Here, in my household. Not as a servant in the traditional sense, but as someone who can help me understand the common people of this colony, their concerns, their needs, their character. You've lived among them, worked beside them. You know how they think because you are one of them. The proposal was so unexpected that Eleanor could only stare. Leave the tavern, leave her uncle, enter into service for the governor, a man whose reputation included both admiration and fear. I know this is sudden, Governor Blackwood continued, interpreting her silence. And I don't expect an answer immediately. But consider this. You're clearly intelligent, observant, and you possess qualities that cannot be taught. Working here, you would have opportunities you'll never find serving ale to farmers and merchants. You would receive fair wages, comfortable lodging, and the chance to make a real difference in how this colony is governed. Why me? Eleanor asked, finding her voice at last. Surely there are others more qualified, more educated. Education can be acquired, he interrupted. Character cannot. You gave away something of value to a stranger without expecting anything in return. That kind of genuine generosity is rare, Miss Hartwell, and it's exactly what I need in these troubled times. Eleanor's mind raced. Part of her wanted to refuse immediately, to return to the familiar safety of the tavern and her simple life. But another part, the part that had always wondered if there might be more to existence than endless days of serving and cleaning, felt a dangerous spark of hope. May I have time to think about this? She asked, and to speak with my uncle? Governor Blackwood nodded. Of course, I'll have you return to the tavern. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. If you accept, send word, and I'll make the necessary arrangements. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation, and Eleanor rose as well. As she moved toward the door, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. Miss Hartwell? Thank you for the cloth. It was the kindest gesture anyone has shown me in quite some time. Eleanor looked back at him, this powerful man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, and saw something in his expression that reminded her of the lonely traveler from the night before. You're welcome, Governor Blackwood. The ride back to the tavern passed in a blur. Eleanor's mind churned with possibilities and fears, weighing the life she knew against the unknown future being offered. When they arrived back at the Silver Boar, Thomas was waiting anxiously by the door, and he pulled her inside the moment the soldiers departed. What happened? Are you all right? Eleanor, what did he want? She told him everything, watching his expression shift from concern to shock, to something she couldn't quite identify. When she finished, he sank into a chair by the fire, shaking his head. "The governor," he muttered. "Of all the travelers to show kindness to." "I didn't know," Eleanor said, sitting beside him. "Uncle Thomas, what should I do?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes. "You should go, child." "What?" "But the tavern will survive," he said firmly. "I managed before you came, and I'll manage again. But this opportunity, Eleanor, your mother would have wanted this for you. A chance at something better than a life of service in a backwater tavern." "You've been good to me," Eleanor said, her own eyes stinging. "I don't want to abandon you." Thomas took her hands in his calloused ones. "You're not abandoning me. You're accepting a gift, one you've earned through your own good heart. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "having my niece in the governor's household might not be such a bad thing for business. People will come just to hear the gossip." Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. Then she hugged her uncle tightly, grateful for his understanding even as her heart ached at the thought of leaving. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small room, listening to the familiar sounds of the tavern settling into sleep. Tomorrow, she would send word to Governor Blackwood. Tomorrow, her life would change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And it had all started with a single silver coin and a whispered moment of kindness that had somehow rewritten both their fates. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Eleanor descended the narrow stairs to the tavern's main room, her decision made. Sleep had come in fitful waves throughout the night, her mind replaying the governor's words and her uncle's tearful blessing. Now, in the gray light of dawn, she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded her of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing she was about to leap. Thomas was already awake, preparing the morning fire. He looked up as she entered, his expression gentle and knowing. "You've decided." "I'm going to accept his offer," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But Uncle Thomas, if it doesn't work out, if I find I've made a terrible mistake—" "Then you'll come back," he finished, rising to embrace her. "This will always be your home, Eleanor. Always. Now let's prepare a proper breakfast. Your last morning here should be memorable." They worked side by side in companionable silence, Eleanor committing every detail to memory. The way the morning light slanted through the tavern windows, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, the warmth of the fire against her face. These simple pleasures had defined her existence for 6 years, and she was surprised by how much she would miss them. After breakfast, Eleanor composed a brief letter accepting Governor Blackwood's offer, her handwriting careful despite the trembling of her fingers. Her mother had taught her to read and write, a rare gift for someone of her station, and Eleanor had never been more grateful for that education than in this moment. Thomas dispatched the letter with a reliable messenger, and then there was nothing to do but wait. The response came within 2 hours, a formal note from the governor's secretary stating that a carriage would arrive the following morning to collect Miss Hartwell and her belongings. The words were impersonal, bureaucratic, but Eleanor clutched the paper like a talisman nonetheless. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Word of Eleanor's impending departure spread through the town with remarkable speed, and the tavern filled with well-wishers, gossips, and the merely curious. Some congratulated her on her good fortune. Others whispered that she was getting above her station, and a few offered genuinely useful advice about navigating life in the governor's household. Eleanor accepted it all with as much grace as she could muster, though by evening her head throbbed and her heart felt bruised. That night, she packed her meager belongings into a single wooden trunk, her mother's cloth, now returned to her by the soldiers along with the governor's letter, a few changes of clothing, the leather-bound book of poems her father had cherished, and a small pewter locket containing a lock of her mother's hair. It seemed pitifully little to represent 23 years of life. Yet it was everything she truly valued. She lay awake again that night, staring at the ceiling beams she'd memorized over countless sleepless nights. Tomorrow, she would enter a new world, one of wealth and power and political intrigue. Would she be equal to the challenge? Or would she prove herself a foolish tavern maid who had overreached? The carriage arrived precisely at dawn, as promised. It was a well-appointed vehicle drawn by 4 matched horses, far finer than anything Eleanor had ever ridden in. The driver helped load her trunk while Thomas hovered nearby, alternating between pride and sorrow. "Write to me," he said, as Eleanor prepared to board. "Promise me you'll write." "Every week," Eleanor assured him, hugging him one final time. "I promise, Uncle Thomas, and thank you for everything." The carriage lurched into motion, and Eleanor watched through the rear window as the silver boar grew smaller and smaller, until finally it disappeared entirely around a bend in the road. Then she turned forward, facing the unknown future that awaited her. The journey to the governor's estate took less time than her mounted escort had the previous day, though it felt like hours to Eleanor's anxious mind. When they finally passed through the gates, she saw the house in full daylight for the first time, imposing and elegant, a testament to colonial wealth and power. Servants moved purposefully across the grounds, and soldiers stood watch at strategic points. It was a different world entirely. A woman awaited her at the main entrance, perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a posture that suggested both authority and discipline. She wore a simple but well-made dress of dark gray, and her sharp eyes assessed Eleanor from head to toe in a single glance. "Miss Hartwell, I presume," the woman said, her voice clipped and efficient. "I am Mrs. Crawford, the household manager. Governor Blackwood has instructed me to see you settled and oriented to your new duties. If you'll follow me?" Eleanor climbed down from the carriage, smoothing her dress self-consciously. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford. I appreciate your assistance." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "You have manners, at least. That's a start. Come along. We have much to cover before the governor wishes to speak with you this evening." Mrs. Crawford led Eleanor through the house, maintaining a brisk pace while delivering what amounted to a lecture on household protocol. The governor's residence, she explained, housed not only Governor Blackwood himself, but also his military staff, political advisors, household servants, and various clerks and secretaries. Eleanor's role would be unique, neither quite servant nor quite advisor, but something in between. "The governor values honesty above all else," Mrs. Crawford said, as they climbed a staircase to the 3rd floor. "He has little patience for flattery or obsequiousness. Speak your mind, but speak it respectfully. He didn't bring you here to echo his own opinions back to him." They arrived at a door near the end of a long hallway, and Mrs. Crawford produced a key. "These will be your quarters. Modest but comfortable. You'll take your meals in the servants' hall unless the governor specifically requests your presence at his table. You're expected to maintain appropriate dress and demeanor at all times. The household rises at dawn and retires at 10 in the evening, unless duty requires otherwise." The room beyond the door was indeed modest, a single chamber perhaps twice the size of her room at the tavern, with a proper bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the estate grounds. To Eleanor, who had never had such space to herself, it seemed almost luxurious. "Your duties will vary," Mrs. Crawford continued, setting Eleanor's trunk inside the door. "Sometimes the governor will want you to observe meetings and provide your perspective afterward. Sometimes he'll send you into town to gauge public sentiment on various issues, and sometimes you'll simply be available to answer questions about how common people think and feel. He's trying to understand his subjects better, you see, trying to bridge the gap between the ruling class and the ruled." "That's an ambitious goal," Eleanor observed. "It is," Mrs. Crawford agreed. "And whether it's achievable remains to be seen. But if anyone can manage it, It's Governor Blackwood. Now then, unpack your things and rest for an hour. I'll send someone to fetch you for the midday meal, and this evening you'll dine with the governor. He wishes to discuss your role in more detail." After Mrs. Crawford departed, Eleanor stood in the center of her new room, feeling unmoored. Everything had happened so quickly. Less than 2 days since that silver coin had appeared on the tavern bar, and now here she was, installed in the governor's household with responsibilities she only partially understood. She unpacked methodically, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her treasured items on the desk. The book of poems, the locket, her mother's cloth, small anchors to the life she'd known. Then she sat by the window and watched the grounds below, where soldiers drilled and servants hurried about their tasks. What had she gotten herself into? The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and instructions. Eleanor met the household staff, a cook named Martha, who immediately reminded her of her mother with her warm smile and flour-dusted hands, several chambermaids who viewed her with barely concealed jealousy, and a young clerk named Benjamin who seemed genuinely friendly and offered to help her navigate the complex social dynamics of the household. "Everyone's wondering why the governor brought in a tavern maid," Benjamin confided as he showed her the library. "Some think you must have impressed him with some remarkable insight. Others speculate there's a more personal reason for your presence." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's nothing like that. I simply gave him a cloth when he left the tavern, and he decided my gesture demonstrated some quality he valued." "Then you have better luck than most of us," Benjamin said with a laugh. "The governor is notoriously difficult to impress. Most people find him cold and unapproachable." "Is he?" Eleanor asked, thinking of the man who had sat in the tavern writing in his journal, looking tired and alone. "See for yourself tonight," Benjamin replied. "He's requested you dine with him in his private chambers. That's unusual. He typically takes meals alone or with his senior military staff." As the sun set and lamps were lit throughout the house, Eleanor changed into her best dress, a simple garment of dark blue wool that her mother had made years ago. It was hopelessly unfashionable by the standards of the wealthy, but it was clean and well-maintained, and Eleanor hoped it would suffice. Mrs. Crawford appeared precisely at the appointed hour to escort her to the governor's chambers. "Remember," the older woman said as they walked, "honesty and respect. He chose you for who you are, not who you might pretend to be." The governor's private dining room was smaller and more intimate than Eleanor had expected. A round table set for two, a fire crackling in the hearth, and windows now draped against the night chill. Governor Blackwood stood when she entered, and for a moment, Eleanor was struck again by the contrast between the common traveler and the powerful official. "Miss Hartwell," he greeted her, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for joining me. Please sit." A servant appeared to pour wine and serve the first course, a delicate soup Eleanor couldn't identify, but that tasted of herbs and cream. Governor Blackwood waited until the servant departed before speaking again. "I hope Mrs. Crawford hasn't overwhelmed you with rules and expectations." "She's been very thorough," Eleanor replied carefully, "though I confess I'm still uncertain exactly what you expect from me, sir." "Honesty," he said immediately. "That's what I expect, Miss Hartwell. I'm surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear, or what advances their own interests. You have no political allegiances, no career ambitions in the colonial administration. You're simply a woman who saw a stranger and chose kindness. That makes you valuable." "I'm not sure one small act makes me valuable," Eleanor said. "It just makes me human." He smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features. "Precisely. You're human in a way that many people in positions of power forget how to be. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what do the common people of Ashford think of my governance?" Eleanor hesitated, then remembered Mrs. Crawford's advice. "They respect you," she said honestly. "They speak of your military successes and your fair administration of justice. but they also fear you. There's a distance between the governor's house and the rest of the town that feels unbridgeable. Instead of taking offense, Governor Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. Go on. People don't know you, Eleanor continued, growing bolder. They know your reputation, your titles, your authority. But they don't know who you are as a person. That makes it difficult to trust you, even when your decisions are sound. And how would you suggest I bridge that gap? I'm not sure you can, Eleanor admitted. Not entirely. The divide between ruler and ruled is built into the very structure of colonial society. But perhaps small gestures matter more than grand proclamations. The silver coin you left, that generosity will be talked about for weeks. Those kinds of moments accumulate. They continued talking as the meal progressed through multiple courses, and Eleanor found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. Governor Blackwood was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions about her experiences in the tavern, the concerns she'd heard expressed by various townsfolk, the rumors and gossip that flowed through Ashford like water through a stream. You're perceptive, he said as dessert was served. A sweet cake with preserved fruit. You notice things others miss. Working in a tavern teaches you to read people, Eleanor explained. You learn to spot trouble before it starts, to understand who needs conversation and who needs to be left alone. It's a survival skill, as much as anything. Those are exactly the skills I need, Governor Blackwood said. This colony is fragmenting, Miss Hartwell. The French threaten from the north, the Spanish probe our southern borders, and the native tribes grow increasingly hostile as we push into their territories. Meanwhile, the colonists themselves are divided. Wealthy merchants versus poor farmers, established settlements versus frontier pioneers, those loyal to the crown versus those who whisper of independence. I need to understand these divisions if I'm to govern effectively. That's an enormous responsibility, Eleanor observed. It is, he agreed. And it's one I can't shoulder alone. That's why I need people like you. People who understand the common folk because they are common folk. People who haven't been corrupted by power or blinded by ambition. After dinner, Governor Blackwood walked Eleanor to the door of the dining room. Tomorrow, I'd like you to accompany me into town. I have several meetings scheduled with local officials, and I want your observations on how they conduct themselves, what their true concerns might be beneath the official platitudes. Will you do that? Of course, sir, Eleanor agreed. Please, he said, when we're alone, call me William. Sir and Governor are necessary in public, but in private, I'd prefer the honesty of plain names. Eleanor felt herself blushing again, but managed to nod. William, then. And you should call me Eleanor. He smiled once more, and in that moment, Eleanor saw past the stern administrator to the man beneath, someone who carried tremendous burdens and felt the weight of them keenly. Good night, Eleanor. Sleep well. She returned to her room in a daze, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. This was real. She was truly here, in the governor's household, about to become involved in matters she'd never imagined concerning herself with. As she changed into her nightclothes and climbed into the comfortable bed, Eleanor thought about the chain of events that had led her to this moment. A single silver coin. A simple gesture of kindness. And now her entire life had been transformed. What would tomorrow bring? What other changes awaited her? She fell asleep with those questions swirling through her thoughts, unaware that the answers would prove far more significant than she could possibly imagine. The following weeks established a new rhythm to Eleanor's life, one vastly different from her days at the Silver Boar, yet demanding in its own way. She accompanied Governor Blackwood, William, as she'd learned to call him in private, on numerous excursions into Ashford and the surrounding settlements. Her role was to observe, to listen, and then to provide her honest assessment of what she'd witnessed. It proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. The first few times, Eleanor felt paralyzed by uncertainty, unsure whether her observations held any real value. But William was patient, asking probing questions that helped her articulate the subtle dynamic she'd unconsciously noted, the tension in a merchant's voice when discussing trade restrictions, the way farmers grew animated when talking about land rights, but fell silent when military conscription was mentioned, the undercurrent of resentment from families whose sons had died in frontier skirmishes. "You're learning to see beneath the surface," William told her after one particularly long day of meetings. They were in his study, Eleanor seated by the fire while he pored over maps and documents. "Most people only notice what's said aloud. You notice what remains unspoken." "I'm not sure that's a particularly useful skill," Eleanor replied, warming her hands on a cup of tea. "On the contrary, it's invaluable," William insisted. "Wars are often fought over what people refuse to say aloud, the grievances they harbor, the fears they suppress, the ambitions they disguise. Understanding those hidden currents helps me govern more effectively." As autumn deepened toward winter, Eleanor found herself growing more confident in her role. She began offering suggestions, some of which William implemented with surprising speed. When she mentioned that the town's poor were struggling with rising grain prices, he authorized emergency stores to be sold at reduced rates. When she noted growing resentment toward soldiers quartered in private homes, he established a dedicated barracks and compensated displaced families. The household staff's initial suspicion gradually transformed into grudging acceptance. Martha the cook became particularly friendly, often inviting Eleanor to the kitchen for late-night conversations over warm cider. Benjamin the clerk remained a steadfast ally, helping Eleanor navigate the complex politics of the governor's household and explaining the various factions and rivalries among the military and political advisors. "You're doing well," Benjamin told her one evening as they walked the estate grounds. The first snow had fallen that morning, transforming everything into a pristine winter landscape. "I've heard several of the senior advisors complain that the governor values your counsel more than theirs." "That can't be true," Eleanor protested, though secretly she felt a flush of pride. "It is," Benjamin assured her, "and it's causing some jealousy. You should be careful, Eleanor. Not everyone is pleased to see a tavern maid wielding influence." His warning proved prescient. The following week, Eleanor encountered her first real opposition from within the household. Colonel Marcus Ashford, the senior military advisor, cornered her in the library one afternoon. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge of condescension Eleanor had learned to recognize. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Colonel," Eleanor replied, setting down the book she'd been reading, a history of the French wars that William had recommended. Ashford circled her like a predator assessing prey. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of a career military man. "The governor has been distracted lately, spending considerable time on matters of public sentiment when he should be focused on military preparedness. I can't help but wonder if certain influences might be leading him astray." Eleanor kept her voice level. "If you have concerns about the governor's priorities, perhaps you should discuss them with him directly." "Oh, I have," Ashford said smoothly. "But William can be stubborn when he's taken a notion into his head. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what exactly are your qualifications to advise on matters of colonial governance? You spent years serving ale to drunken farmers. Now you sit in council meetings and whisper in the governor's ear. It's quite the ascent." The insult was clear, though couched in polite language. Eleanor felt anger kindle in her chest, but forced herself to remain calm. "I don't presume to advise on military strategy or political theory, Colonel. I simply share observations about how common people think and feel. If that's useful to the governor, I'm glad. If not, I'm sure he'll tell me." "The governor is a brilliant military mind," Ashford continued, "but he can be naive about human nature. He sees goodness where others might see manipulation. I'd hate to discover that his faith in your integrity was misplaced." Before Eleanor could respond, a voice spoke from the library doorway. "Is there a problem here?" Both Eleanor and Ashford turned to find William standing there, his expression unreadable, but his eyes cold. The colonel straightened immediately, all traces of menace vanishing behind a mask of military professionalism. "Not at all, Governor. Miss Hartwell and I were simply discussing the afternoon's agenda." "I see," William said, though his tone suggested he saw considerably more than Ashford might prefer. "Colonel, I need you to review the latest intelligence from the northern frontier. We'll discuss it at tomorrow's briefing." It was a clear dismissal. Ashford bowed stiffly and departed, leaving Eleanor and William alone in the library. For a moment, neither spoke. "How much did you hear?" Eleanor finally asked. "Enough," William replied, moving to stand beside her. "Colonel Ashford is an excellent military commander, but he's uncomfortable with anything that challenges traditional hierarchies. I'm sorry you had to endure that." "I can handle it," Eleanor assured him, though her hands were still trembling slightly from the confrontation. "I don't doubt it," William said. "But you shouldn't have to. Your value here isn't diminished by your background, Eleanor. If anything, it's enhanced by it. You see things my educated advisors miss precisely because you come from a different world." His words warmed her more than she wanted to admit. Over the past weeks, Eleanor had developed feelings for William that went well beyond professional respect. She admired his dedication to fair governance, his willingness to question his own assumptions, his rare moments of humor when the weight of responsibility lifted briefly from his shoulders. But she had firmly suppressed those feelings, knowing the impossibility of anything more than the working relationship they'd established. Winter deepened, and with it came news that forced all personal concerns into the background. French forces, allied with several native tribes, had attacked frontier settlements along the northern border. Refugees began streaming south, bringing tales of burned homesteads and brutal violence. The colony was moving toward war, and William was consumed by the demands of military preparation. Eleanor saw him less frequently during those weeks, their easy conversations replaced by brief encounters as he rushed from one crisis meeting to another. She continued her work, now focused on gauging public sentiment about conscription, provisioning the military, and supporting displaced families. The mood in Ashford grew tense and fearful. One evening in late December, Eleanor was summoned to William's study well after dark. She found him standing by the window, still dressed in his formal coat despite the late hour, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. He looked exhausted. "You sent for me?" Eleanor said softly. He turned, and she saw the strain in his face, lines of worry she hadn't noticed before, shadows beneath his eyes. "I wanted your advice." "About military matters? William, I know nothing of warfare." "Not about tactics," he said. "About people. Eleanor, I'm going to have to call up the militia. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 will be required to serve. I know what that means. Families left without breadwinners, farms left untended, businesses abandoned. I know the hardship it will cause. But if I don't act, more settlements will burn, more families will be slaughtered. What would the common people have me do?" Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the world looked peaceful, pristine, untouched by the violence gathering on the northern frontier. "They would want you to protect them," she said quietly, "even if protection requires sacrifice. People understand necessity, William. What they can't abide is indifference. If you acknowledge their sacrifice, if you do everything possible to support the families left behind, they'll accept what must be done." "You're certain?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "I'm not certain of anything, but I know that people respond to genuine concern. They can tell when someone in power truly cares about their welfare versus when they're simply being used. You care, William. Make sure they know that." He reached out and took her hand, the gesture startling in its intimacy. "Thank you, Eleanor, for your honesty. for your insight, for being here. Eleanor felt her heart race at his touch, at the warmth in his voice. For a moment, they stood together in silence, and she wondered if he felt it too. This connection that had grown between them, inappropriate and impossible, though it might be. Then he released her hand and turned back to the window, and the moment passed. "I'll draft the conscription order tonight," he said, his voice once again businesslike. "And I'll establish a fund to support the families of those who serve. Perhaps you could help administer it. You know which families truly need assistance, and which are simply seeking advantage." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, though part of her mourned the return to professional distance. She left his study and returned to her room, where she lay awake for hours, thinking about William's tired face, his rare moment of vulnerability, the warmth of his hand in hers. She had crossed an ocean of social distance to reach this place, and yet the final gulf between them seemed unbridgeable. A governor and a tavern maid. The very idea was absurd, and yet her heart refused to accept that logic. Christmas came and went with subdued celebration. The household staff exchanged small gifts. Eleanor received a warm shawl from Martha, a book of pressed flowers from one of the chambermaids, and a handsome leather journal from Benjamin. On Christmas morning, she found a package on her desk with no note attached. Inside was a beautiful silver brooch in the shape of a bird in flight, delicate and clearly expensive. She knew immediately who had left it, though he'd never signed his name. Eleanor pinned the brooch to her dress and wore it every day thereafter, a secret acknowledgement of feelings neither of them could voice aloud. The new year brought colder weather and darker news. The French attacks intensified, and William departed in mid-January to personally oversee the colony's military response. He left Colonel Ashford in charge of the household and civil administration, much to Eleanor's dismay. Without William's protection, Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated. Ashford made no overt moves against her, but he systematically excluded her from meetings and ignored her suggestions. The other advisors, sensing the shift in power dynamics, followed his lead. Eleanor continued her work supporting the families of conscripted men, but she felt the loss of William's presence like a physical ache. Letters arrived periodically from the frontier, though they were brief and largely impersonal. Reports on military operations, instructions for Ashford, official communications with civilian authorities. Eleanor cherished the few lines that seemed directed toward her, reading meanings into simple phrases that might or might not have been intended. February brought a brutal snowstorm that isolated Ashford for nearly a week. When the roads finally cleared, a messenger arrived bearing news that sent shockwaves through the household. Governor Blackwood had been wounded in a skirmish with French forces. He was alive, but recovering at a military outpost 2 days' ride to the north. Eleanor's first instinct was to go to him immediately, but Mrs. Crawford gently explained that would be impossible. "The roads are barely passable, Miss Hartwell. And besides, the military camp is no place for a young woman. You must wait." Wait. Eleanor felt the word like a prison sentence. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, helping coordinate relief efforts for families whose homes had been damaged by the storm, organizing collections of food and supplies for the soldiers on the frontier. It was all she could do to keep from going mad with worry. 3 weeks later, word came that William was returning to Ashford. Eleanor stood with the rest of the household staff as his carriage arrived, her heart hammering as she waited to see him. When he finally emerged, leaning slightly on a walking stick, she had to suppress a gasp. He looked older, drawn, a bandage visible beneath his coat on his left shoulder. But his eyes found hers immediately across the crowded entryway, and in that moment, Eleanor saw everything she'd hoped to see. Relief, gladness, something deeper and more complicated that made her breath catch in her throat. The household erupted in welcomes and questions, and William was swept away by his advisors demanding immediate briefings. Eleanor retreated to her room, telling herself to be patient, that she would have time to speak with him eventually. It was nearly midnight when a soft knock came at her door. Eleanor had been sitting by her window, unable to sleep, and she hurried to answer. William stood in the hallway, still dressed though he'd removed his coat, his face illuminated by the candle he carried. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Eleanor knew it was improper, knew that admitting him to her room at this hour violated every social convention. But she stepped aside without hesitation. William entered and closed the door behind him, setting the candle on her desk. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the space between them charged with months of unspoken feelings. "I'm glad you're safe," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought of you," William replied. "When I was wounded, when I lay in that field hospital wondering if I would recover, I thought of you, of your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. Eleanor, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I'm a governor," he finally said. "You're a tavern maid. The social distance between us is immense, and there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't." He trailed off, then started again. "But when I was lying there wounded, none of those reasons seemed to matter. All I wanted was to see you again." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "William, I've felt the same way. From the beginning, I think. But I told myself it was impossible, that I was being foolish." "It probably is impossible," William interrupted. "Society will condemn us. My political enemies will use it against me. You'll be subjected to cruel gossip and social ostracism. Everything rational tells me to maintain proper distance." "Then why are you here?" Eleanor asked. William moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the vulnerability in his expression. "Because I've spent my entire life doing what's rational, what's expected, what serves the greater good. And in that field hospital, I realized that life is fragile and short, and wasting it on propriety while denying genuine feeling is the greatest foolishness of all." He reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into the contact, feeling as though she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. "Eleanor Hartwell," William whispered, "I am asking you, despite all the reasons we shouldn't, despite all the obstacles we'll face, will you allow me to court you properly, to see if what we've built here might become something more?" Eleanor opened her eyes and saw in his face the same hope and fear she felt in her own heart. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, William, I will." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as though she were something precious that might break. Eleanor felt warmth flood through her entire body, felt years of loneliness and uncertainty dissolve in the face of this impossible, wonderful reality. When they finally drew apart, William rested his forehead against hers. "This won't be easy," he warned. "There will be opposition, scandal, perhaps even attempts to remove me from office." "I know," Eleanor replied, "but I've learned that the most valuable things are rarely easy. You taught me that, actually, when you left that silver coin. Sometimes a small gesture of faith is worth more than all the careful calculations in the world." William smiled, and in that smile, Eleanor saw not the stern governor, but the man who had sat alone in a tavern, writing in his journal, looking for something he couldn't name. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." The weeks that followed were both exhilarating and terrifying. William made no secret of his intentions toward Eleanor, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Colonel Ashford resigned his position in protest, taking several junior officers with him. The town's wealthy merchants and landowners whispered that the governor had lost his senses. Anonymous letters arrived daily, some threatening, others simply cruel. But there were unexpected sources of support as well. The common people of Ashford, the farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen, whose concerns Eleanor had championed, proved surprisingly loyal. They saw in William's choice a validation of their own worth, A governor who would court a tavern maid was a governor who truly saw them as equals in some fundamental way. Thomas sent a letter that made Eleanor cry with gratitude. "Your mother would be so proud of you, dear girl. Follow your heart, and know that you have my blessing always." Mrs. Crawford, initially scandalized, eventually came around after a long conversation with Eleanor. "The governor is fortunate to have found someone who sees him as a man rather than merely a position," she admitted. "And perhaps love is reason enough, even when reason says otherwise." The military situation stabilized as spring approached. A temporary peace was negotiated with the French forces, giving the colony breathing room to regroup and strengthen its defenses. William threw himself into this work, while also navigating the political fallout from his unconventional courtship. Eleanor continued her role advising on civilian matters, though now she faced open hostility from some quarters. She endured it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of tavern work, refusing to be intimidated or shamed. On a warm evening in late April, William invited Eleanor to walk with him through the estate gardens. Spring flowers were blooming, filling the air with fragrance, and the last light of sunset painted everything in shades of gold and rose. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a small gazebo overlooking a pond. William stopped there and turned to face Eleanor, his expression serious but tender. "7 months ago," he said, "I walked into a tavern planning to test the character of its proprietor. Instead, I met a woman who showed me kindness without expectation of reward, who saw past titles and authority to the person beneath. Eleanor, you've changed my life in ways I never anticipated." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Eleanor's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It's not elaborate," William said, suddenly sounding uncertain in a way she'd rarely heard from him. "Nothing like what wealthy families exchange. But pearls are formed through adversity, layer by layer, something beautiful created from irritation and struggle. It seemed appropriate for us." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as William knelt before her, this powerful man humbling himself in the most traditional of gestures. "Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me? Will you stand beside me not as an advisor or a companion, but as my wife? I know I'm offering you a difficult life, one full of social challenges and political complications, but I'm also offering you my heart, completely and without reservation." "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, William, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. They stood together as the sun set completely, holding each other in the gathering darkness, two people who had bridged an impossible distance through simple acts of kindness and courage. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the estate's private chapel. It was a small ceremony by the standards of the wealthy, just the household staff, a few close friends, Thomas Hartwell beaming with pride, and a handful of officials who had remained loyal to William despite the controversy. Eleanor wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant, with the silver bird brooch William had given her at Christmas pinned over her heart. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. A single silver coin. A whispered impulse to show kindness to a stranger. Decisions that had seemed small at the time, but had rippled outward to reshape both their lives completely. The resistance to their marriage continued, of course. Some colonial families refused to acknowledge Eleanor socially. Political rivals used the marriage to attack William's judgment. There were difficult moments when Eleanor questioned whether her presence was truly helping or hindering William's ability to govern effectively. But there were also moments of profound joy and partnership. Eleanor's insights into the concerns of common colonists proved invaluable as William worked to implement reforms that made governance more equitable. Together, they established schools for poor children, reformed labor practices that had bordered on exploitation, and created mechanisms for ordinary citizens to petition the government directly with grievances. The colony stabilized under William's steady leadership, and even his critics had to acknowledge that his policies were effective. The French threat receded, trade flourished, settlements grew more secure. And through it all, Eleanor and William built a life together, one marked not by grand romantic gestures, but by the steady accumulation of shared moments, mutual respect, and deep affection. They worked side by side, challenged each other intellectually, found comfort in each other's presence during difficult times, and celebrated victories both large and small. One evening, nearly 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor stood in the same study where William had first explained why he'd summoned her from the tavern. She was looking through correspondence from various towns in the colony, letters thanking the governor for his policies, requests for assistance with local problems, reports of successful harvests and prosperous trade. William entered and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you reading?" "Letters from people we've helped," Eleanor replied, leaning back into his embrace. "Or tried to help, at least. Sometimes I still can't quite believe this is my life now." "Do you ever regret it?" William asked quietly. "The simple life at the tavern? The lack of complications?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," she admitted. "But I wouldn't trade what we've built for anything. We've made a real difference, William, not just in governance, but in showing people that the barriers we construct between classes and stations are less solid than they appear. That kindness matters more than propriety. That love can bridge any distance if both people are willing to take the risk." William kissed her forehead gently. "You took the greater risk. I had the protection of my position, my authority. You had nothing but courage." "I had you," Eleanor corrected. That was enough. They stood together in the study as evening deepened into night, two people who had defied convention and expectation to create something genuine and lasting. The governor and the tavern maid, the powerful official and the common woman, the man who had left a silver coin, and the woman who had whispered kindness in return. Outside, the colony continued its daily rhythms. Farmers tending their fields, merchants conducting their trades, families gathering for evening meals. The world turned as it always had, indifferent to individual dramas and personal triumphs. But in that study, in that moment, two lives intertwined completely. Eleanor and William knew a truth that transcended social barriers and political calculations, that the smallest gestures of genuine humanity often carry the greatest power to transform not just individual lives, but the very fabric of society itself. Years later, when Eleanor was old and gray, grandchildren playing at her feet in the same estate that had once seemed impossibly distant from her world, she would tell them the story of how a single silver coin and a whispered act of kindness had rewritten not just her fate, but the fate of everyone touched by the love and partnership that followed. She would tell them that courage comes in many forms, sometimes as grand acts of heroism, but often as simple willingness to show kindness to strangers, to trust one's instincts about character, to risk rejection for the possibility of connection. And she would tell them that the distance between any two people, no matter how vast it might seem, can be bridged by those willing to take the first step, to extend the hand, to offer the gesture that says, "I see you as you truly are, and I value what I see." That was the lesson of the silver coin. That was the whisper that rewrote both their fates. And it was a lesson Eleanor Hartwell Blackwood never forgot, not for all the remaining days of her long and remarkable life.